Staying warm? Come on, baby. Come on. Okay, here we go. Whew. All right, there we go. Now we're on. Good morning. Well, Mickey informed me that you drive a 1917 Ford.
Is that what it says?
No.
Oh, 1970. Yeah, it's been a good one. We kept the maintenance.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Look, those cars are pretty ventilated.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if they even had heat. I don't think they had heaters. It's about 40 something. Yeah. Oh, she said, he said, you said,
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Like they couldn't fix that. I always think that's what I drill in my head. The cheapest thing you can do is change the damn.
Yes, yes. I am religious about that. Yeah, it's a little hard to do right now.
It's annoying when you put that tire pressure camera in my head. It tells you the tire pressure is low. My part is the which tire. It's a temperature.
I did that twice in the past 2 weeks.
Yeah, the chicken tires anyway.
Still, yeah. It turned out to drop like 5 psi. I was still like 30 something. I'm like,
It's not dangerous. I know.
yeah.
You're concerned that it's severe.
Right.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. Neither time. It was just a little bit.
Some of these things don't help as much as they think they do.
Yeah.
And yet, my son had a Chevy for a Chevy truck. He had that anymore. The best things it had were the infotainment center. You plug in your phone, and I like using Google Maps.
Oh, yeah.
And that's not what comes in the car. The Chevy, you plug it in and you can have the news on your phone. And when his tires would be low, it told you exactly which one with the pressure was. And then you knew or immediately or what.
Right. All right, everybody. We're kind of getting a late start today, but that's nothing new. I want to welcome you to Valentine's Day. In case you forgot, any husbands in the room, if you forgot, remind your fellow husbands, and let's prevent any unneeded executions. But it is cold outside, and yet it is good to be in God's house. When we have gas heat, which is a wonderful, miraculous, modern invention that the vast majority of church history did not get to enjoy. So we will enjoy it. We are in 1 Peter. So if you want to turn there, 1 Peter chapter 3. We are going to be looking at a couple of verses today that are going to be a prelude to, I don't know if you'd call it the peak of the discussion in the book of 1 Peter, but this section is very important. And you can tell I put as much wording on this page as I could because it really is worthy of our time. We're going to be diving into everything from evangelism to persecution to proper conduct, and there's just a lot here. This is definitely a deep dive into Christian faith. So if you wanted meat, today you're going to get meat. All right. Well, would somebody read, now it's in the New American Standard, and this drives me, the NASB is arguably the best English translation, but it has a problem with run-on sentences. I don't think Paul had a problem with run-on sentences, but the New American Standard has a problem with run-on sentences. So would somebody read verses 13, 14, 15, and 16, even though we're only talking about 13 and 14?
Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear. Do not be frightened. But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander.
All right. Thank you, Mickey. Appreciate that.
That was not the NASB.
Okay. And I'm not saying it's exclusive to the NASB, but there are times where it goes on for 6, 7, 8 verses, and I'm like, no. It's an English translation. In English, we have a thing called run-on sentences, and they shouldn't exist, but that's because I'm a nerd and I care about such things. All right. Well, verse 13. This verse sort of stands alone in a way, but it does have to do, it does, of course, apply to the passages around it, but we're going to start with that and then move on to the meat of the passage. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? I really had to kind of take a step back and think about that one, because what good deed goes unpunished? Right. And the truth is, oftentimes, in fact, I teach my children this, the youth, in youth group, Alex and I talk about this, that oftentimes when you do good, people will be jealous and they will come after you. That is a common behavior. If you are successful, in fact, one of the most important phrases in business I ever learned when I was a young entrepreneur, an older man told me, everybody will wish you success until you are. And then they will be jealous of you, and then they will downplay what you're doing, and they will vote to tax you to death. That's what they'll do. And so this verse can't mean that. And the Bible itself, and this is my first point on your page there, teaches continuously that persecution comes naturally for the righteous. And I included lots of passages there. We're not going to go to any of them because I think that's, self-evident to anybody who's been in the faith for any period of time. And you've probably experienced this as well. When you are a Christian in a non-Christian world, and one downside to the internet and the constant connectedness of today's world is the rural areas are now more affected by what's happening in the urban areas much faster. An idea that would stick on the East Coast for 20 or 30 years now gets here instantaneously. Things you would never hear about before now come immediately. So it's easy even in our own county and in our own culture to stick out and for people to ridicule you or people to make fun of you or talk bad about you or even possibly attempt, my kids have experienced this, to sabotage you. Because nowadays, if you're a Christian and you hold to the Christian worldview and anybody finds out at all, suddenly you're a racist, homophobic, transphobic, terrible, horrible human being. My kids have dealt with this multiple times, all of them have, except for Luke so far. And I think it's because Luke's young, but also because Luke doesn't yet understand the gentle part. He can bite back as hard as anybody can throw a punch. But so I really had to dig deep into this verse and think about biblical examples and think about my own experiences. And this is where I arrived, and I want your input, okay? What I put down is verse B. What this verse is saying, at least in part, is that pursuing what is good pays off in the long term, and disproves lies spoken about you in time. And I think that's true. You know, one thing I've taught my kids is that, you know, just because people make fun of you, don't give it any heed. Keep going. Don't worry about what anybody else is doing. You do what you're supposed to do. If everybody else is leaning, you clean. Don't worry about anybody else. And then over time, people will realize that you are good and valuable despite things about you they don't like. In fact, I've had conversations with businessmen in our community who try to find out in whatever way they can if a kid regularly goes to church. And one of the reasons why is because if a kid regularly goes to church, there's a chance he has some sense of morality. At least there's a chance. But so many times now, it's very hard to hire a teenager because you're hiring a child. You're hiring somebody who has no sense of work ethic, no sense of responsibility, has no problem stealing stuff, you know, treating a job as a paycheck and not as a mission. And so that's what I got out of this verse, is that being good pays off in the long term and it disproves lies spoken about you in time. But I'm opening up the floor here. Anybody else have any thoughts on this verse? Richard.
Well, I can't help but identify with you trying to teach your children how to deal with these situations. This whole thing about racism is a real problem. I'd like to remind everybody that we're all members of one race. It doesn't matter what color we are, the color of our skin, or our economic situation, or anything else. We're all members of one race. God only made one people. And you talked about not arguing with these kind of people. Jesus didn't argue with them, but he would give them one short little sentence that would just shut them right down. They couldn't argue with this. But I always taught my children this idea that be a leader, not a follower.
Yeah.
Some people will leave with you when you leave a situation like that, and they'll thank you later. That how many countless times I've had people when I stood up for a situation and left. People came to me afterwards and said, "Man, I'm so glad you changed that whole thing just because you made a stand." That's what leadership's about.
Yes.
You don't have to be John Wayne to be a leader. You just need to have to speak the truth. And the truth, the Bible says, will set you free. And it'll set other people free. That's what we have to do. Be a truth teller and be a leader. And you will never have to worry about these kind of things. And it won't hurt you when they call you names. Because you can say, hey, to yourself, my Lord suffered the same indignities. That doesn't put me in the same place as him. That puts me in the right place.
That's a great point. So many times when there is an oppositional ideology in place in the workplace or school or whatever, there's a bunch of people who think differently, but they're afraid to speak up. And all it takes is one person to do the right thing and speak up, and then suddenly there's just tons of people who are like, come out of the shadows for you.
Remember what fear is. It's a tactic of the enemy.
Yep. Great point. Okay, anybody else?
You don't have to speak either, just your example.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep.
I've had occasion or two that, not that I'm perfect, I'm not saying that, but people that I just knew, we spoke. And so they were standing there, they was all having a beer. And the father said to the son, they ain't just offered him any because he don't use it. And I didn't even know he even knew I went to church, really. So our example, just the way we live, speaks words.
Absolutely.
You know, speaking about words, we could have a whole discussion about curse words. I have found it extraordinarily useful to never use them, if only because, and I think I personally think it's wrong, like, shouldn't do it, but even if somebody doesn't, and I've ran into Christians who think, it's no big deal, or it's just semantics. And I'm like, no, you sound like the world. When you use those words, they think you're one of them. they think you think like them and act like them and talk like them, but when you don't use those words, and everybody else around you, I mean, you've probably met people, I know I have, and my wife certainly does in the prison, who use the F word like literally every other word. It's essentially an adverb to everything. And when you're the person who doesn't use that language, you stand out in a good way. And when I was a teenager, I cussed like a sailor, and it still just very rarely, occasionally comes out, and I'm ashamed of it. But I've learned the power of not using those words, because it tells everybody in the room, this guy's different. There's something about him where he doesn't follow the Pied Piper. And that's very useful. So if you're going to argue with me about, semantics, we're supposed to be a peculiar people, and you're ruining witnesses by using those words. I'm just being honest with you. You just are.
Josh, I may have shared this with you before, but I was 16 years old when my dad got transferred to Spain. We moved from Southern California. 16. Everything was boss and bitchin', but what I found out was when I would speak to Spaniards and they would say, "What means this bitchin'?" It was profound to me to make it, you get lazy in your speech when you use that as a shorthand.
Yep.
And cuss words are the same thing. And it makes you speak more carefully because you're not communicating with those words.
Yes. I've often found that what they are is a filler for people who aren't thinking. You actually have to speak intelligently if you're going to avoid that language. You have to think about what you're doing. So that's just something I want to put out there. All right, good discussion. This is going great because, man, I was a little lost with this verse.
I've listened to people talk, and I think it's the most disgusting word ever, the F word. I can maybe see men using it, but when I hear women use that word, that just cuts to the heart.
I don't think they should be given.
What?
I don't think men should be given special consideration.
No, that's not her point.
I know.
Just it has a special nastiness to it. Go ahead.
But used to, if a preacher walked up to a group of men, they cleared their voice all up good. If a lady walked up, they quit. Now it don't make any difference to anybody.
Right.
Alex and I still occasionally run into people who will be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cuss around you." And then my response is always the same: "I'm not your judge, but I know who he is." You really should think about that. Yeah.
It's been several years ago, but one of the kids was in sports, and we were sitting at a basketball game, and a bunch of young men come up and sit down with us, and they started in just every other word, this, that, and the other. And I turned around and I said, if you all are gonna talk that way, would you please move? And they did.
Wow.
They did.
Yeah, Richard.
When I was on the school board, Kelly, we had a superintendent named Bob Grimshaw. Some of you knew Bob, a fine Christian man. And he left Callio and went to Macon, became the elementary school principal. And about 2 years later, all the teachers came to school, the first day of school, and it was like chaos. They couldn't all understand what was going on. Well, sometimes they used to do this, I don't know if they're doing anymore, but you go to school 2 days that first week, and then the third day is teachers' meeting. So you got the day off, kids can recover, the parents can recover, everybody has a day off. Well, the teachers' meeting was on a Friday. And as the teachers filed into the room, Bob told me this to my face, we were discussing the world, what was going on, as two Christian men concerned about the young people. And he was telling me that the teachers were just dumbfounded. They said, "What's happened over the summer? Our kids have come back to school and they're cussing like we've never heard. Every other word out of their mouth was a cuss word. What has happened?" Does anybody know what happened that summer? You ever hear of Beavis and Butthead?
Yeah.
It came out that summer. And Bob says, "Let me show you what happened to your students this summer." He already knew it was a problem. He played it on the TV screen like you got behind your head. And they all saw 10 minutes of Beavis and Butthead. When they shut it off, everyone teacher said, "Yeah, that's exactly the words they're using." That's what happens. Now, what I'm trying to say is our culture glorifies that kind of thing. So we, as God's people, have to be different. I appreciate and understand. Sometimes Linda has some boldness there. I would just got up and moved. That would make a statement too. But it takes boldness to confront that kind of thing. And we don't confront it. You know, it's in the halls of our Congress now. Watch TV and see what's going on. I don't have an answer. I'm just trying to tell you it's a sign of the times.
Yep. Oh, for sure.
Worst Gus and I ever seen was a Little League baseball game.
I don't even want to get started on sports. I don't even want to go there, Mickey. You're going to tempt me, but I ain't going there.
Another experience. At a ball game, people behind us, I don't know whether they're thinking, oh God, oh God. And the other, I jumped up and I said, Sam, where is it? They looked at me like I was crazy.
Good for you.
Did they
Yeah.
quit?
Quiet down.
You know, that's great. You used humor, and that is so good. I mean that. Like, I've learned, and I teach my kids this, if you're trying to quell a behavior, today, kids don't respond to shame, guilt, and force as much as they used to because they have options. They have the choice to be where they are and what they're doing most of the time nowadays. Regardless if they should or not, they do. But if you use humor and you make fun of something silly they're saying, in a way that doesn't make fun of them, just makes fun of what they're saying, that has that effect and it makes them double think what they're thinking. And that's really useful. So use humor. Yeah.
My wife's put me in my place a few times.
My wife works in a prison, and occasionally when we go to just see normal people, I have to remind her, we're not going to go visit inmates. And she's like, oh yeah, I'm going to be nice. Because that's her world. Little kids and inmates. That's her world. So the teenagers are left to me. All right. Man, good discussion. I have learned a lot, and I appreciate that. Sometimes commentaries in Greek doesn't teach you what wisdom and experience can. So, all right. Well, let's move on to verse 14 and on. This is meaty stuff, and as you can tell, because I've got a lot written down here. But I want to keep it open to discussion too, because you've got a lot more to share than I do. But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. Boy, is there a verse Christians need to hear right now worldwide. And we need to be training ourselves to hear as persecution gets closer to our own doorstep. Because when it comes, we have a choice of our response to it and our attitude to it. Many times in the early church, I wrote down one passage there, Acts 5:41, but many times in the early church, when the church was persecuted, and sometimes very severely, people would die. Their attitude was, what a blessing it is to be counted worthy of suffering for the behalf of our Lord. And you know, that never would have been my natural response to persecution. It never has been. The natural response is the worldly, the earthly, the fleshly response, right? They hit you, hit back. But there's even I wish I could remember what it was now. There's a passage where it says they celebrated for having been counted worthy of suffering for the behalf of the Lord. What an attitude. What an amazing attitude. That's how much they valued the salvation they had and the hope they had in the Lord. And so these are, in a sense, benefits to persecution. Because if you're doing the right thing and you're being punished for it, that's a sign you're doing something right. I've told my kids that. When people are jealous of you and come after you, that's a sign that you're doing the right thing. It's hard to think that in the moment, but if you know that and you anticipate it, it's less painful because you know you're on the right track. You know, the Bible also describes, Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, that there's two roads, the wide and the narrow. You all know this. And the narrow is less traveled. And so there's fewer on that path, but it leads to glory. So Another benefit to persecution, and this is what I really want to dive into, is it separates the serious from the casual. The first parable that Jesus ever speaks is in Matthew 13. And in this parable, he illustrates this idea perfectly. There's one set of seed, there's 4 sets of seed in the story, but there's one set of seed that falls on rocky soil. And they spring up immediately, but they have no depth of soil, so when the sun rises, they were scorched and they withered away. And we've all seen this, weeds in the cracks of your concrete. And they don't grow very tall, but they're there and they spring right up constantly. And then what do? We're the sun that scorches them down. Weed eat them, whatever. So it's a very good illustration Jesus uses because it's timeless. But this is referring to people who have no depth. They were not presented the gospel, and this is, now I'm going a little bit into opinion here. I think I'm right. There's 2 ways to win people to the Lord, although there's only one way that'll last. And I used to practice the other way a lot because I'm an outgoing person who's excited about the Lord and want to share Him with as much people as possible and get people in the baptistry as much as possible. I mean, you all know I used to do like 15 baptisms a year. One of the reasons why I don't anymore is because I'm no longer interested in getting people wet. I'm interested in making disciples who study the Word. And if you're not interested in being a disciple who's going to study the Word, there ain't no point in getting you wet. There isn't. If you're not going to commit to this, knowing the price you pay for being a disciple, you don't pay for salvation, but you pay a price for being a disciple, then there's no point in getting you wet because I'm just giving you false hope. And I'm ticking a number on the church board that makes everybody feel good and a false sense of security. And no, that's not what evangelism is. And this is why, and I explain this in the sheet here, I'm getting a little bit out of order, but I don't know if you've ever read a modern book on evangelism. 99% of them are about trends and fads and just plain silliness. My first year at Lincoln Christian College, brand new preaching student, 18 years old. I went to my freshman year at Lincoln, and a book that I had to buy and had to read for a class was The Purpose-Driven Church by Rick Warren. It's a book with a fantastic title with 0 useful content. And let me tell you why. Because it's not about a purpose-driven church. The moment you get into the book, you realize it's a seeker-sensitive church that he wants you to have. He wants you to make the church look and sound like the world, but preach the gospel? Really? And his book convinced a whole generation of new preachers that they need to get rid of Christ in the church of their name, and they need to bring in rock music and concerts, and they need to dress like the world and act like the world and talk like the world and avoid things like sin and their preaching. Don't even call it preaching. Don't even call it church. I mean, that book inspired a whole generation of evil, I'm sorry to say. And it took me a few years to figure that out. There's no such thing in the Bible, in the New Testament, that a preacher has to wear a shirt and tie, but I promise you I will always wear a shirt and tie in the pulpit. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that people who go to work for business, especially in higher business, still wear a shirt and tie. And if you're going to go to a formal dance or dinner, you wear a shirt and tie. But preaching the Word of God doesn't deserve at least that level of decor. I don't even call it preaching anymore when I see a man on stage wearing flannel that's untucked with holy jeans, preaching a sermon series called From the Grill or something. That's a real thing. I've seen that. He doesn't mention sin, salvation. He doesn't mention repentance. It's just a feel-good motivational talk. That's all it is. Inside of a building they call a church, maybe. We got to recognize a false gospel for what it is. That's good news in the sense that you'll feel good when you leave the building. That's it. And I'm not normally a negative poo-pooer on other people kind of guy, but the older I get, the more I realize that we can't go there. And this is, I think, Wayne mentioned this before. You know, the churches used to have a lot in common, used to get together a lot. The preachers all were friends. You know, I don't have that kind of commonality with other churches and other preachers, even in our own county, really, because of the division books like that have done to take the Bible out and replace it with the seeker-sensitive community garbage. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. But all you're doing, when you have a church of 1,000 people who were given the gospel on rocky soil, the moment persecution comes, and it comes, who are the first to leave? All those people. Your church of 1,000 is really a church of 0, if that's how they were won to the gospel. One of the best lines for evangelism I ever heard in my life, and I'm so glad I heard it relatively young, is, you have to keep them with what you win them with. If you win them with rock concerts and free food, guess what they think the gospel is? Rock concerts and free food with some Jesus. And that ain't Jesus at all. You know, Jesus, God in the flesh, unlimited power and money and access to resources, and he could have done anything. What did he do? He came as a common man, totally without any of the fads or trends or power or flash. And he just taught truth. And he loved people. That's what we need to do. Truth and love. And the people who don't respond to truth and love aren't going to become disciples and students of the Word. So is Callio Christian Church ever going to be a church of 500 in Macon County? No. I'm sorry. No.
There was a time, though, not too long ago, that it could have been.
Yeah.
9/11.
Yep.
Churches were full.
Yep. And you know what came out that same year? That stupid book. So people flocked to churches that were full of this. I mean, you can walk. I told you about a church recently I was trying to figure anything about at all, called Vineyard Anaheim. That's the name of the church. You go to the website, you can't even tell what they believe or anything. They don't talk about any of it. You can't even find the service times. There's just a number to call. What? You know, we got to get back to Romans, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power. It's power to those who believe. I mean, oh my gosh. So I'm never going to, I have people who, it doesn't happen as often as it used to by any means, but I used to have people all the time who hand me this book or that book or whatever, and they think, oh, this is the way to do it. This is how you do it. And you know what I discovered about evangelism books? They're about as useful as diet books, and look at me. I've tried everything. Truth and love, diet and exercise. It's the only answer. Okay, off my soapbox again. Opening up the floor. Thoughts? Did I say
Now we
anything?
read the virus situation. And it was good to put church so you could see it on your phone. I see that. But Satan used that so much. There'll be people, and this is not just not taught in the Christian church. I've talked to other people from other denominations. They all feel the same way. Going to lose people.
They have
They'd rather
badly.
just sit at home in their pajamas and do nothing. And they don't get that fellowship that brings you closer together in the church.
The virus has destroyed, not the virus, people's response to the virus has destroyed many churches.
Yeah.
And it's these rocky churches, these shallow, meaningless churches that lost everything and everybody. Yep, so true. So God's already shown us, He's been so good to us because we're largely speaking intact and doing fine. And we were streaming before the virus for the sake of our shut-ins. That's who primarily watches it. And we're very grateful for the technology so they can enjoy that. In fact, when I go visit them, they are very grateful they can do that. But it will never replace church at this church, at least never again. That was my mistake for a few weeks. So we won't do that again. So yeah, good point. Very good point. Anybody else? Yeah, Richard.
Oh, a month or so ago, you had some real exciting news to share. I was aware of what had happened, but I was surprised at the response of most people because they weren't excited like you were. That in the state of Missouri, abortion was no longer being practiced in clinics. We still had Planned Parenthood, but it had moved off of our borders. Irma handed me a similar newspaper announcement, a little small article in the corner of the newspaper. Many people, I'm surprised, didn't even know that California had banned worship. The state of California, they can't worship indoors. Until this week, when the Supreme Court of California said, no, that's a fundamental right of the Constitution, and you can meet and worship. And we have an article right here that Irma handed me from February 7th. I just want to point out that we as Christians are often our worst enemies because we ought to be shouting this from the housetops, this kind of thing, and we're not. But boy, you sure heard the neighbors out. And people's response to that is all over the LA papers. The politics in that state are angry that this is happening. But the people of California are recalling their government. They're just a few thousand votes away from having this guy have to run for election again because he's so against these godly things. But let me caution you, that's the times we're living in. It is not going to get better. Don't expect it to get better. It's going to get worse. But we, of all people, don't have anything to be afraid of.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, preaching too.
No, that's great. That's exactly correct. That's still the best piece of news I've ever read in the media in my life. Never thought I'd see that day.
Amen.
Because I was born 10 years after abortion was forced upon all the states, so it was just.
By the way, I have a prayer card, so I'm going to share it with the class. We all know we've been praying for my niece who has Down syndrome, was going to be born this week. She came 2 weeks early.
Okay.
They've named her Abigail Nelson, and she's doing extremely well. She has some heart defects they're going to have to do surgery on. But Sarah, my niece, says she's just a fabulous little child, and the whole family is just ecstatic.
Good.
And she sent some pictures, and the husband, her husband Brent, was having a hard time. I think I told her when he was angry at God. And you ought to see him carry that little baby. He's just, like I said earlier, he's coming she's coming, it came to it now. Fine family, 2 weeks premature, but doing great. And her doctors recommended she abort that child.
Can't remember if it's Scotland or Ireland or which country it is that brags that they don't have any Down syndrome kids. And the reason why is because they kill them all.
That's right.
We haven't figured out how to genetically prevent that.
And just a few years ago, you wouldn't even know what would happen to a child.
You didn't even know what sex it was until relatively recently. Yeah.
Well, I hold up to people that back in the, was it the 80s? Yeah, late 70s and early 80s, a Down child became a star on TV.
Yeah. Corky.
Yeah.
I read an article recently where there was a dad who had Down syndrome, and this woman who did not have Down syndrome purposely married him because he was a hardworking, good man. Worked on a factory doing some really mundane, but he didn't care. You know, one of the advantages of not being super smart is you can do repetitive tasks and not get bored. So he worked hard, he raised his kid as best he knew how, and his son, who does not have Down syndrome, absolutely loves his father. And there's every study and research out there that shows you when you have somebody with a disability in your household, it makes everybody a better person. It does. It teaches you compassion from a young age. Absolutely.
I've never met one that was mean or
No.
spiteful. They're the sweetest people.
Yeah. And their capability of doing harm, even if they want to, is so limited, which is pretty awesome. And yet, who are the ones we kill? Yeah. Okay, move it right here. That was good. Very good. Excellent. All right. Well, let's look at the second part of this verse. Do not fear their intimidation and do not be troubled. There's a verse in Matthew. I wish I knew what it was now. It just occurred to mind. But I quote it a lot because my children will come to me with a situation where they're fearful of something, and I say, the Bible says, do not fear man who can only destroy the body. Fear God who can destroy both body and soul in hell. One useful function of having a healthy fear of God is that we look at people who threaten us and be like, you're not really much. I know somebody bigger and badder than you. And that verse sounds really intimidating and sort of has a negative way of saying something positive, because the positive thing is you don't need to fear man. You fear God, you don't need to fear man. That's why Paul brings up here, don't fear their intimidation and do not be troubled. No reason for that. There's blessings in persecution, even though our flesh doesn't want to tell us that. The Bible tells us that. Any thoughts? We're near the end here, so I'm opening up the floor. I know we've covered a lot today, and man, it's been good. Thank you for the discussion. I learned a lot today. And on a super frozen, cold day, it's good to be in God's house and to have these talks. So,
I'd say, Macon County has a shelter workshop that do a lot of recycling.
yeah,
And most of them are slow.
Yep.
But they are the happiest people who take stuff out there. And, you know, keeps them employed rather
Yep.
than, sitting around doing nothing.
right? And they get a
It really
great
makes a
sense of
difference
worth
for
from it.
those people.
Yeah, yeah. Those places are worth supporting, for sure.
And you do, it's on the property taxes. So
Good.
since you're affording,
Hey, great.
limited amount.
It's nice that my taxes go to something I appreciate. We're not going to get into that. Okay. All right. Well, Alex, would you close us in prayer?
Sure. Father, thank you again for allowing us to be able to be here when the weather's really cold and there's lots of excuses to stay home. But just grateful for everyone to be here, be able to have good discussion, and just be with us as we go out and worship and throughout the rest of our week. Love you. In Jesus Christ's name, I pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you all. All right. We'll see you.